building muscle, building strength, building power. So those are three fundamental objectives of strength training. Building our muscles, making them bigger, building our strength, our ability to put force out, and then building our power, which is the ability to make like that fast force. And I hope at the start of this podcast today that I've made a good argument why all three are important across our lifespan, and they're not just for athletes.
Totally.
So
Yeah.
when we think about building our strength, that's the heavy strength training piece. So if you imagine being in the range of probably anywhere from 3 repetitions up to about 8 repetitions, it's an ideal zone to be able to increase our strength. And when we say increasing our strength, that means we are trying to lift heavier weights. Now, that doesn't mean that, you have to lift the same weights as I lift. It means that that's defined for you, right? So it's how much weight can you lift in that range of 3 to 8 repetitions. But it is really important to say that for you, you need to be in a zone where you are, let's say, aiming for 4 or 5 repetitions, and you're going to try to push for 7. So you're trying to push the envelope. One thing that I'll just sort of caveat here before I go into the next zone is that when we're doing this zone for strength, sometimes I call it zone 3 training for strength. So it's the development of strength. We have a lot of questions in the literature about whether you have to go to a point what we call momentary failure. And
Right.
you may know momentary failure because you're in the gym, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't think I can lift this.
Right.
And
Yeah.
maybe I need, and that's maybe where you need a spotter. And what's really interesting to just for your listeners' own information is more and more evidence shows us that you don't have to go to momentary failure.
Right.
But it's good to get kind of close to it. So what I like to say is when we're trying to build our strength, we're going to be in what we call zone 3. We're going to be lifting heavier loads around 3 to 8 repetitions. And what I'd like us to think about is maybe you're picking a weight that you do 5 times, and if you're feeling good, you try to push for 7.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right in that zone where, but I could not do 8.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good way to think about how we build our strength. The second zone that I want to talk a little bit differently about is this idea of building our muscle size, right? So we call this hypertrophy, and building hypertrophy, and I'm going to call this our zone 2, which is going to be now where maybe we're starting at 8 repetitions and we could go as high as 30.
Mm-hmm.
So now this is the zone where your conventional could be like, your typical programmer, you may be doing 12 repetitions in a row, getting kind of close to momentary failure. That's kind of maybe a familiar zone for your listeners. But if you think about that zone now, we sort of start at a basement of 8 reps,
Mm-hmm.
and we can maybe go all the way as high as 30, which is now meaning that the loads are going to be a little bit lighter. The rest intervals are going to be a little bit shorter. We're going to be working more volume in our program, right? And
More
this is going to be a
exercises
zone that's really good. Yeah,
yeah.
it'll promote the sort of increases in our muscle size.
Yeah.
And then the final zone I'll throw out around power, and we're going to call this zone 1.
Right.
Zone 1 would now be taking kind of lighter weights, but trying to lift them fast. So this would be a scenario where, maybe I've got a weight on the bar that's only maybe 30% or 50% of my max, but I'm actually trying to move the weight really, really quickly. So you've got these 3 zones. And what is sort of the fun thing about building your training program is that picking one zone as a focal point for maybe 6 to 12 weeks and then moving to another zone for 6 to 12 weeks is a really good way to do long-term strength training. So to boil it down for you, if we were working together, we might pick a 6 to 12 week period where you're going to be in zone 2, and we're going to be picking full body movements. We're going to be doing somewhere between 8 and 30 repetitions. Our goal is going to be to increase the size of the muscles, and to do so, with full body movements, shorter rest, and then you get to your second quarter of the year, and you change to zone three, and now you're focused more on a strength building phase. Now we're going to work between that 3 to 8 rep range, heavier loads, and the goal is to get stronger. So that's a really simple way to think about strength training. Is that if you again, when I'm teaching our students about the idea of like power, strength, and hypertrophy, and how we use different loading for each of those, it starts to form a really nice model for how we can train over the long term by emphasizing one of those zones over the other over our training periods. So that's it's one way that you can approach it.
I mean, I can see this coming together, which is really exciting. But what if, so obviously when women hear, well, not all women, but a typical lady would hear, muscles getting bigger, and she would
Yeah.
probably think, oh, can we skip that phase? Like,
Yes.
I don't
Yeah.
want
Yeah.
that. Can she skip that phase? Like, and does she get bigger? Like, what's happening? Like, because the muscle does get bigger. Like, I have to kind of, I feel my muscles getting bigger, and but not in a huge way. Um,
Yeah.
and that's true, right? Because of the hormones, like we don't have the testosterone that men have, and
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what's really interesting is that um, so just if you kind of like recap these three zones, zone three, zone two, zone one. Zone one's your power.
yeah,
Zone two is your muscle hypertrophy,
I'll have much
and zone three is your strength.
strength. Yeah.
What's really interesting is when we are, if you want to skip the muscle building component, so this is the hypertrophy component. Um, One of the ways that we'll often do this, and sometimes I'll take the example of athletes who are like in a weight class sport. So maybe you're in a sport where you don't want to increase your size because it's you're competing in an event where that's a limit. What we will do is we will leave out the zone two, so they'll have only a focus on the strength building and the power building. So right off the hop, if your listeners are very, very if the idea is to skip the muscle building, that's totally reasonable. And and this is something that's sometimes a bit counterintuitive, is that lifting the heavy weights in zone three, like where you're in that, let's say I'm going to do 3 reps and push to 5. We often think that that's the zone where you're going to be bulking up because it's heavy weights,
Mm.
but actually
Yeah.
it's actually the total opposite. That's the phase where we are working on our expression of our ability to make strength. It actually really heavily involves our brains. So we're essentially, if you think about it like this, like a skill, like think about like playing the piano
Mm.
or playing the violin, where it's a skill that we have to sort of express. Being in zone three, where we're lifting sort of heavier weights and trying to emphasize our strength, is it's just like building a skill.
Yeah.
And your listeners might be pleased to know that that zone is actually uh, been shown to have a minimal effect on increasing muscle mass.
Mm.
So 100%, if I was in a scenario where you had a client who said, I'm not interested in building muscle, I would stick out of the zone two, but I would educate them on the fact that zone three training, when we're lifting heavier weights, for 3 or 5 repetitions, when you're like, oh, geez, that seems like that's going to really bulk me up. I would try to educate them to say, you know what, that's actually a zone where we're going to be building your bone strength, your tendon strength, your muscle strength. And it's actually a zone where we expect to see minimal increases in the size of your muscle. So you get a lot of the benefits of strength training by being in that zone three without having that muscle building look. So it's a good way to remember that with strength training, the levers we pull have really specific effects on whether our muscles get big or we get strong or we increase our power. But
Right.
all three are important across our lifespan.
Okay.
So yeah. So hopefully
Yeah.
that helps. I mean, it's sometimes a misnomer that lifting heavy weights is the stuff that's going to bulk you up. That's not true. There's sometimes a misnomer that all strength training will make me bulky. That's not true. A lot of times to really put on muscle, it requires a lot of work.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of nutrition. So you can be sort of rest assured that simply doing three strength training sessions a week is probably not going to be enough to make you big and bulky.
Yeah.
And the final piece that you mentioned that I'll just touch on quickly is about hormones. And what's really interesting is that certainly on average, obviously male individuals will have higher testosterone, and testosterone is a very important anabolic hormone that promotes the increases in muscle size, but lots of other things too. But what's really interesting is new research comes out and looks at the ability for women to proportionally increase their muscle mass. So, like the ability for the same relative change between men and women with resistance exercise seems to be a lot more similar. So, certainly like the absolute changes tend to be larger in men, but women are also able to increase muscle just like men are. So there's a lot of parallel there in
Mm.
terms of our responsiveness of our bodies to strength training.
Um, so I'll just give you a personal experience or just personal update on where I'm at with my program. So I do strength training, and I've been promoting it a lot online and talking about how great it is. But then, you know, so a lot of women, a lot of people like myself, we want to just build one area. So let's say you want to
Yeah,
build the glutes. So
sure.
is it
Yeah,
is it is it like is it safe to do, let's say, strength training, but then to throw in some hypertrophy for like one muscle group, like your hips, your glutes?
100%,
Okay, because
100%.
that's my
Yeah,
program. Yeah.
100%. And you know what? And this is the beauty of strength training. You can have, because strength training can be so regionally targeted, you could 100% say that I'm going to be in a training phase where I'm going to try to think about increasing my, leg strength and my leg power so that I don't increase my muscle size
Mhm.
globally. But I'm going to have two exercises at the end of my strength day
Right.
where I focus on the developments of, glutes and hip extensors as a more hypertrophy focus.
Yeah.
And what you just described, which I love, is you just talked about building a meal. You
Yeah.
said I'm gonna have my main thing that I want to have on my plate, and then I'm gonna have a nice dessert at the end of like, something that is like a different focus or goal. Strength training is the same thing. You've got your main part, and then you add in this thing at the end that's focused on something that you want to achieve or do, which could be hypertrophying a region,
Yeah.
of our body, or it could be addressing like another one as well that sometimes is a different goal, but could be equally important. Is sometimes individuals may be focused on injury prevention. So maybe you have listeners who are playing recreational soccer or competitive soccer still. I know that's a really common. The actual increase in women who are participating in competitive sport across the lifespan has increased dramatically. And maybe there's women who are listening to this who say, hey, I wanna increase my leg strength and my leg power, but maybe as a secondary goal is I want to get my hamstrings really strong so I don't hurt my knee,
Mhm.
because hamstring strength might be an important factor that helps keep our knees safe. There's another example where maybe we add on a piece to our program that's really specific,
Yeah.
oriented with a goal that we have that's very personal,
Yeah.
and that's 100% a great way to approach building a good strength training program. So I love that you're doing that because it's I would say it's an amazing part of strength training is that you can build a program like that and achieve goals that are highly personal.
Mhm.
And it's an awesome way to build it.
And the way I see hypertrophy training and then strength training, like hypertrophy training is the lactic acid, the burn, the fatigue,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
just
yeah,
that the soreness, the pain. But
yeah,
that's what stimulates the growth, right? But then strength just
yeah.
doesn't hurt. It's just it's the brain, like you said. It's just
You
can
got
you
it.
lift it? It just doesn't hurt. Yeah.
100%. The big drivers of being able to create muscle hypertrophy responses, so making our muscles bigger, is the volume of training that we're able to do. So, having a high volume of training is a real big driver of making our muscles grow.
And that would mean
And
like many exercises, many sets.
many
Yeah.
exercises, many sets in that zone where, in that zone two training, you might be doing 8 to 12 sets per muscle group or body part. You're doing, repetitions between 8 and 15.
Yeah.
You're getting the
That's gonna
burn. You're
hurt.
feeling that,
Yeah.
sometimes we call it the pump. It's like the short rest. All that type of training is hypertrophy oriented training. And you totally nailed it. When we talk about zone three, which is our strength building, think about the skill of making force and think about,
Skill. Yeah.
it's a quality program. It's
Mm.
short, it's focused, it's got high loads, but it's done in a very minimal way where you don't really feel the burn after. You
No.
feel more the effects of like pushing your brain and your
Yeah.
muscles to push out that high level of force that you're not used to doing. So
Yeah.
they're very different
They are
feelings, and
very
that's why
different.
strength, yeah, very different. But just for your listeners to again, I want to just reiterate this: that heavy strength training that we're talking about in zone three, which I'm sure your listeners have experienced this fear of being like, well, I don't want to bulk up, and they may be inclined to say, well, I should lift light weights. I should just keep it really light and work on tone. I want to just illuminate for your listeners that heavy strength training where you're in that zone three, what you described is that like my muscles don't feel that burn. I just feel like I'm lifting heavy weights. It is so beneficial for women across the lifespan. It is so beneficial for increasing bone health, muscle health, tendon health, for increasing our strength to sort of keep our functionality across the lifespan. And that's just a whole different way to think about strength training. And it's not the type of strength training that bulks you up. It's this type of strength training that really increases your ability to make muscle force. So it's an important thing to mention that that zone three work, as you describe it, is just so good for us, especially for women. So,
And the one
yeah.
rep max stuff, she doesn't, would you say she doesn't really need to touch on that? Like
Mm-mm.
to figure out how much she should be
Nope.
lifting in strength. Okay, so no need for
No,
testing
no,
how much she can lift
no,
in one
no
repetition.
need. No.
Okay.
You know what you can you what I would say you do as a perfect starting point is you find a weight that you can do 5 or 6 times and it feels pretty hard. Like you're right at the point where you're like, oh my gosh, I don't think I could do 7.
Hmm.
You're right at that point, but you're not at that point where you're like, oh my gosh, I can't lift 5. Like you
Yeah.
can get that 5 or 6 repetitions and then you try to push for a couple of more.
Mm.
And so if you're feeling good that day and you're like, I did my 5, feeling good, I'm
Mm.
going to try to push for 7.
Yeah.
That's the mentality of strength building. And I think you don't need to test your 1RM. You just need to find a weight where it's kind of hard for you at 5. And so one of the things that I might do with you if we were, let's say, doing a program together, and let's say we were focused on a deadlift, is we might do 5 repetitions at a time. And we would start with a really, kind of a light weight that you're comfortable with. And we would do incremental sets where we add more weight each set. And we would work till we find that point where it's like now we're at 100, maybe now we're at 40 kilos. And you're like, oh, this is getting heavy. And we push, 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 push. Like we get to close to 5. And I'm like, could you push for 6? And you're like, this feels like it's right about my limit. That's now the weight that you're going to use for the next 12 weeks as our starting point.
Mhm.
And as soon as you can do that weight and push to 7, the next workout, we're going to add a little more weight. And then we're going to do our 5, push to 7. Next workout, you can now do your 7, add a little bit more weight. Maybe you stick there for a few workouts where you're like, yeah, this is hard. And, but I always am, and the day that you can do 5, push to 7, we add a little bit more weight. And so you think about doing that workout to workout, and that's how we increase our strength.
Because you're
So,
staying in the zone
um,
three. You don't want to go above.
yeah,
And yeah, that makes
well,
sense.
and that's, yeah. And if you go above, that's where your
Yeah.
listeners need to understand, like, that's the zone where our muscles get big.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, that's
and,
really
and, and,
interesting.
and so it's really important to know that, being in that zone three is where we get our strength.
Mm.
It's also where our bones grow. It's where our tendons grow. It's where our muscles get strong. So it's really good for your body to do that. In fact, we're doing studies right now with women who are early postmenopausal women, and I'm involved secondarily on this study. The primary investigator is Dr. Lee Gable is her name, and she's a bone researcher. And what she's applying with early postmenopausal women. So these are women who are now 1 year after having lost their period, and they're in that early postmenopausal transition. It's a phase where, and I'm learning this more and more, it's a phase where women are at very big risk for increased bone loss. So your bones start to, that's where you lose a lot of your bone loss or bone mass. And then over time, that's what sets us up for that long-term sort of like fractures and those sorts of things. And what Dr. Gable has been investigating with about a 9-month strength training program with women who are postmenopausal is looking at the effects of heavy strength training, doing exactly what I just described. So being in that zone where you're kind of about 5 reps, push to 7, deadlifts and squats. And I can tell you right now that the increases in muscle are pretty small. So nobody's bulking up. But you know what's getting bigger? Bones.
Wow.
You know what's increasing? Strength. So it's a really interesting project for your listeners to sort of think about that. These may be women who've never strength trained in their life, and they're doing that zone 3 heavy strength training and seeing great physical benefits from it. So it's just a crucial thing to sort of paint a picture that this is more than just sort of an option. It's something that could be really good, and you don't get those benefits by staying light.
Gotcha.
So